Okay, finally then, I think. So it's a pleasure to introduce Minuchin, who's from the Senior Lecturer in Architecture and Global Urbanism in the Department of Architecture, School of Environment, Education and Development. His work focuses on the politics of construction, and I'm literally reading here from his bio, the role of infrastructural repertoires in the consolidation of extended networks of solidarity and preservation. So I think my interpretation of that is that we're interested in the way architecture feeds into social movements and one thing another.
And this, and this will be the new kind of spin-off to new research. I'll introduce it.
Okay. He's also created Material Politics, which is a kind of website network that focuses on the fabrication of radical infrastructures and frames construction architecture as a language for local politics. Anyway, so today he's going to talk about architectures of exit, libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, and the substitution politics. Yeah.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you for the invitation. But I get use the screen so Alfredo can see me. Well, thank you for the invitation. This is, as I was saying, this new research that I started in 2023. When it was becoming clear that Milei was, sorry, but it was clear that Milei was going to win, or had strong chances of winning the election in the presidential election in Argentina in 2023. And a little bit of background: I come from political theory and political science. Ended up doing my research in architecture. And so I went back to my roots, panicked, started reading again, went back to the classics of libertarian theory, which we had forgotten, and they were always regarded as minor in my undergrad degree. Became familiar with them again, expanded the reading. And strangely, I decided that I needed to get something out almost immediately. I had the impulse to actually do research. I started crying basically when I heard that he was elected president and feared for my university. And the first thing that came out was a novel. So I spent a good semester writing a speculative research on libertarian dystopias, basically. Whilst at the same time finding out what was behind Milei's grandiose and almost dystopic appearances. I discovered that there were a series of interconnected think tanks, NGOs, international organizations promoting what they refer to as exit programs. And so today, I was going to talk a little bit about what they mean, how they're organized, and more specifically, I want to put across one point, which is that underlying the libertarian project, there is a logic that politics shouldn't just be cancelled, but substituted. And the way they are hoping to do that is by multiplying the possibilities and forms of exit. And I will hopefully spend some time talking about what do I mean by exit, how do they come about. But maybe I will start with throwing back into some of the mindset. So this is a prototype for an autonomous enclave in Panama, promoted by ocean builders working together with Water Studios Architecture in the Netherlands. And it's a project that at the time is, as of today, is running in Colón, promoting, being offered almost as an Airbnb. Not this one, it's a slightly different, more kind of basic one. The overall aim, which of course is not just to remain as an Airbnb opportunity, but is to create a collection of autonomous pods in the middle of the sea, to create a network of autonomous structures where people can reside with their own residency that will be non-Panama residency, to create what they hope will be like a network state. And I know the language I'm using seems far-fetched and almost, you know, I don't know, William Gibson or Stephenson's kind of cyberpunk kind of literature, but it is in the writing, in the project. This was part of what the grandson of Milton Friedman developed within the Seasteading Institute. So when the financial crisis broke in 2008, the grandson, who I think there should be a biography between the Milton Friedman's son and the grandson, because it's unbelievable the evolution, coherent, but a radical kind of transformation. So the grandson basically thinks that we should move on from just lobbying and trying to reduce and shrink the state and expand market dynamics. And he basically suggested that the only way we can do that is if we secede. And because there's no available land, we should basically become pioneers in populating the sea. So he developed, with Peter Thiel backing and other Silicon Valley people, the Seasteading Institute, to develop multiple possibilities, not just in Latin America, but in the South Pacific, opportunities to actually exit the state, with the logic that the premise is that there is the biggest market that has not been open and deregulated is the market of governments. We are forced, they suggest, to live in a highly kind of rigid structure of dwelling, and citizenship is so loaded with baggage that it poses too much friction. We can't easily move as if we move from grocery store to grocery store. We can't decide with the same frictionless capacity how to choose a donut as to how we choose where we reside. So what we should exploit is the market of government, turn the industry of governance into a new market opportunity. And the only way to do that is to multiply them by 1,000. So we need to create exit strategies where it could be in the sea, it could be, as I will explain in the Honduras case, as part of a spatial zone, or it can be online. You know, they are pushing for a metaverse-like dwelling scenario where you can exit governance structures and develop new ones, new rules, as the Nobel Prize economist Paul Romer suggested. So I guess the key argument that I want to put forward is, and I will hopefully do in the talk, is libertarianism, which, and by the way, I will clarify, the libertarianism I will be speaking is the American developed type of libertarianism that emerged after Ayn Rand, after the 50s, and unfortunately, I will not touch too much on the left-leaning radical libertarianism that is also present in the US, but that's not the one I will be referring to. We can then have a discussion as to how they connect and how they completely differ. But so I'll be talking, when I refer to libertarianism, is capitalist libertarianism and at times anarcho-capitalism. And what I'll be telling is a story of how they went from theoretical minority, obscure groups within economic institutes in Las Vegas with Rothbard and others to becoming perhaps a force that is pushing for radical forms of innovation in governance, lobbying governments, including the US, for example, with the proposal to develop 1,500 new freedom cities, which these are private enclaves within the US, exit forms of municipality. And so the story that I'm going to be telling today is also a story about how the libertarian movement is moving from theoretical propositions, lobbying, think tanks calling for a minarchist kind of position, a minimal state, to directly trying to prefigure alternatives, moving into action. I will then conclude, of course, saying that the projects I'll be telling you about are absolute minuscule in terms of their potency or their presence. But I will make a claim that we shouldn't, at this stage, we should take notice not because of the scale, but what they propose and how they are operating. So hopefully I can make that claim. Otherwise, what I'm saying is this is not an attempt to capture rare beasts that are floating up in the air as a rare case. I'm trying to make the case that we shouldn't focus on their size, but we should focus on the principles, on what they entail, and what they're trying to project. So to organize the talk, I will, because I wasn't familiar, the audience being very diverse, so I will be presenting very briefly what are the kind of theoretical underpinnings of this libertarian movement. I will move quickly because I want to focus mainly in the theoretical part on what they mean by exit. How does exit work within the libertarian political thinking? And I will hopefully illustrate this project by focusing on 3 cases in Latin America. One is in Honduras, in the island of Roatán, called Próspera, which is live. It's kind of the gem in terms of point of reference for the libertarian movement. The second one is very small, is almost a residential enterprise led by a Canadian kind of entrepreneur in Panama for Veritas villages, and they're expanding across the Caribbean. And lastly, I will make a slight kind of suggestion as to how we can read a particular piece of legislation that was put forward by the Milei administration that seeks to incentivize large investment projects in Argentina, but with the libertarian edge to it. Those will be the cases, and I can do with a couple of points as to why I think this is something that we should pay attention to. Let's say the libertarian movement expanded between 2 critical events. The new wave of libertarianism was brought to the fore between the financial crisis and the pandemic. And the reason for it was because what they were able to contest was a radical expansion of the presence of the state. So underpinning libertarian thought is the idea that there is very little justification as to why the state should be involved with the potency of the self or the individual. Lynch and Atkinson suggests its primary tenets in relation to libertarianism include the belief that all human associations should be voluntary. And this is quite important. The ideas of citizenship, forms of belonging, collective identities are artificial impositions for libertarianism. That private property is a fundamental and natural right from which all human freedom is derived, and that the sole function of the state, and that's for the ones that still believe that there should be a minimal state, should thus be to prevent coercion and protect private property. That means, in principle, and the key text for this is Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia in the 70s, the classic, in opposition to Rawls. But there's no justification as to why the state should be involved in education. There's no justification as to why the state should be involved in policing. There's no justification as to why the state should be involved in health or any other matter, including potentially controlling the currency. One of the key kind of tenets that they always pop out, and that Milei recuperated in a grandiose way, which unfortunately the events in the last 2 years, he went in a different direction. But that's why we should go against central banks, because it's basically an involvement of an arbitrary institution that is trying to actually force and intervene into the dynamics of the currency. But from a libertarian perspective, even the treasury or the central banks are an interference, even if they are autonomous. It's a step beyond neoliberal kind of arrangements. Rather than appealing to ideas of nation or supposed national characteristics, libertarians envision the citizen consumer as consumers of the future, voting with the feet. And that's for them really important. So ultimately, when you start from the position of the individual and the self, the ultimate democratic principle is not expressing your desires through mediation, representation, and the vote. Is by choosing as you would choose within the logics of the market. So voting with your feet means if I don't like this set of rules, I should move away and choose another set of rules. There's nothing in relation to the contract of citizenship that ties me to that civil order. I should be free enough, frictionless, so I should say, you know what, that. And in a way, that's why a lot of libertarians, particularly from the 60s, when we look at Rothbard in America, they go back to the founding fathers, but even before that, to John Locke, for example, and say, if we read Locke carefully, Locke being the kind of father of liberal thinking and liberal institutions, say, the right to rebel was central to Locke's logic. So Locke, in the 17th century, said, if the parliament puts up taxes without my consent, I should have the right to refuse. Locke didn't see it at the time and said, well, that right should basically allow you to go somewhere else and settle somewhere else. But if we look at the kind of heroic figure of Walden, when he, Thoreau escaping to Walden, right, in the 19th century, it's many people say, oh, Thoreau escaped to nature and is an ecological. He was escaping taxes as well. Right? He was escaping taxes. He, of course, and I'm not denying it, he was escaping, or he was presenting an opposition to issues of slavery, absolutely. But at the same time, he was opposing the presence of the state, particularly by putting up taxes, expanding through an army, expanding with economic institutions, which he rejected. So for a lot of Americans working on libertarian thinking from the 60s, is a historiographical revision of the founding fathers of the US, to the point where Rothbard would suggest that the States was born as a libertarian state. We were supposed to remain autonomous autonomous kind of states, completely free from each other, with no central state, no army, and it was a discretion. It was a forking path that we took wrong that ended up us forcing to have a massive central government. The original principles of the state I'm talking about Rothbard reading the history of the US, right? I'm not saying that this is the case, but so there's an interesting revision of history from the libertarian movement. Now, with these principles in mind, the proposition when you are facing a financial crisis that meant that central banks would print more money, where central banks will and governments will prop up companies, ignited and gave justification to libertarians that remain very marginal. You know, if in the US, the Libertarian Party gets 1.2, 1.5% of the vote, if that. They still present themselves sometimes in some states, but it's completely marginal. But the financial crisis and the response to the financial crisis from central governments prompted and ignited a new wave of libertarians, particularly young libertarians, which grew and started to create institutions like the Seasteading Institute, like the Free Cities movement. Paul Romer suggesting that we should create charter cities, all that from 2008 onwards. And the pandemic, with again, the state imposing civil restrictions, lack of, imposing restrictions on movement, imposing a vaccination from a libertarian perspective. That is almost an example of the limits to where the state can go in terms of interfering with individuals. Right? Those are the two macro events in Badiou's term, almost historic events that for the libertarian movement justified moving from theory to practice. we will not get far by lobbying and say, oh, the state shouldn't be involved, we should change economic policy. That's not going to cut it. It's not going to cut it. It's an amazing book by Slobodian that he kind of traces this think tanks, radical thinkers before the financial crisis. And the book extends to it, but he does, I think, a very good job in kind of laying the foundations, particularly for one point which I want to highlight, and it's going to be fundamental. When philosophically libertarianism suggests that you vote with your feet, that you should be capable of choosing the rules that govern, that you want to dwell with voluntarily, what they're kind of suggesting and implying that democracy is a friction, is an imposition of the majority on the self. For libertarians, there is a particularly new wave of libertarians. There's a direct contradiction between capitalism and democracy. Capitalism is the ultimate and only means of organizing economic relations that preserve the individual. And democracy, basically, from a libertarian perspective, is a machine that allows party politics to justify the expansion of the state. There's no way you can run elections without justifying higher taxes or some way of presenting taxes because your policies somehow need them. So from a libertarian perspective, again, from a libertarian perspective, there's no way that you can justify the alliance between democracy and capitalism. However, in contrast to what I'll be discussing this later on, there's been a rapid take on associating this libertarian type of thought with the outright and authoritarian anti-democratic stance. And even though they share a lot of cultural, social positions, they are not the same. Because ultimately, from the type of commercial libertarianism that I'll be speaking about, the solution is not to bring the military and countries, democratic institutions to run the country from an authoritarian perspective. It's to exit. So their position is not because democracy is incompatible with capitalism, we need to bring back an authoritarian structure. The proposition is different. With this, I'm not saying that people in the alt-right are directly hinting at the need to transform or reform democratic institutions. What they are hinting at is that we need to extend the right to vote with your feet. We need to transform, and Patrick Friedman suggests this, we need to transform the right to exit and move away and set up the rules we like to live with and whoever we want to live with as a natural right. Our natural right is not to be protected in a true liberal naturalist contract from Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau kind of way. To justify the presence of a civil organization is the other way around. We need to move to associations where we can organize ways of creating our rules without justifying the need for any other form of power. That's where the anarcho element to some of the libertarian expressions, right? Peter Thiel, which some of you would be familiar with in terms of Silicon investments, in a journal where he published his kind of libertarian upbringings, so why I'm leaning towards libertarianism, presented this point very, very clearly. I no longer think that freedom and democracy are compatible. And that's something really powerful. Now, how do you then materialize this notion of voting with your feet, of preserving freedom and capitalism, if you're doing away and need to move away from state organized structures? At the heart of this new libertarian way is the notion of exit. And one of the arguments I want to put forward is that that's been there from the beginning. That's been there from Ayn Rand. So many of you would have heard of Ayn Rand, either Mountainhead or Atlas Shrugged or Anthem. I mainly focus, even though I think it's present in Mountainhead as well, I mainly focus on these two books. Anthem was published in 1938. It's one of the earliest novels, and Atlas Shrugged was published in 1957. To run it quickly, in Anthem, Rand imagines that the world is dominated by a global communist government that has a council of wisdom that has demodernized humanity to the point where there are no longer notions of physics or electricity. And so the main character, who's called Equality 7215, because they lost the capacity to say I, because they live in a collective structure, and they can't, the novel doesn't pronounce, you can't pronounce until the end. I don't want to spoil it. Yeah, the word I has been banned, not banned by decree, but it's no longer even imaginable. That's kind of the biggest kind of point. The character discovers by chance, going into a tunnel, a light bulb, presents it to the council. The council basically condemns him by going against the will of the collective and suggesting this kind of heretic or illusions. And he escapes into the forbidden forest. So Rand structures the possibility of finding the self, preserving the self, and in the end, almost the entire civilization through an escape structure. So Equality 7125 then escapes to the forbidden love because, of course, relationships were scripted, but he manages to fall in love with a person that follows him in that escape. And they find an old cabin where they have relics of the past, books where the word I and the self flourish. And the book suggests that civilization starts from that escape. There's the possibility of hope in the middle of a context that, allegedly, communism still reigns. Right? I mean, there's no suggestion in the book. Atlas Shrugged goes a step further and suggests, I don't want to use too much time on this, but basically there's another escape structure. So Galt, the main character, in a dystopian America that is being run by union members that want to nationalize the steel industry and other industries, suggests that the only way to escape this is not to bring economic reform, is not to bring change and try to win an election, but to escape. Escape to Colorado and let capitalism, or that version of capitalism, decay and collapse to then rebuild. And so we can also look at Atlas Shrugged as being structured around the notion of escape. It's interesting that when you read Rand's account, and if you ask any conservative politician, and including Trump, who probably hasn't read any of the books, when you ask politicians in the Reagan administration, in the Trump administration, the idea is, which one is your most inspirational text? Oh, it's Ayn Rand. But never because of exit. Right? Anyway, I need to move on because otherwise I won't make it. I won't go. The reason why I can spend a lot of time on this because I'm writing the book. So I've been doing a lot of kind of literature review on exit. And of course, exit has been with us from the moment we imagined the city itself. It's in Homer and the Odyssey when, in the Iliad when Achilles has a fight with Agamemnon and says, I'm going to keep the woman, and he says, no, you're not. And Achilles basically goes to his tent. And the heroism of Achilles is built on that gesture of escaping. And it appears in philosophy. Nietzsche, Zarathustra goes to the mountains to actually find the truth. and it appears in science fiction. And science fiction is fundamental for libertarianism. It appears in not only in William Gibson, but in Stevenson, this idea that you can escape through the matrix your body and the decrepit state of the city. Right? So there's also this movement of escape that is very present. The moon is a harsh mistress. There are so many kind of science fiction. A great book in Spanish that has been looking at the connection between science fiction and this new capitalist kind of enclave. This is a recent book by Leandro. And this is another great book that he's been tracing some of these ideas. But for libertarians, the possibility of exit allows you to preserve the individual and capitalism. It's only through that movement that you can actually achieve it. In a very dark, violent book, The Dark Enlightenment, Nick Land, which is associated with the neo-reactionary movement associated with libertarianism, he says, even more than equality versus liberty, voice versus exit is the rising alternative. And he's making reference to a very famous book by Hirschman in the 70s that he wrote about from an economic perspective, the use of exit and voice. Voice meaning politics, right? The possibility of expressing your opinion in public through votes. And libertarians are opting for voiceless flight. Patrick Friedman remarks, we think that free exit is so important that we've called it the only human right. Another character which I think is very influential from Silicon Valley to understand this notion of exit and how, so exit is a meta concept. It's about alternative. It's a meta concept that subsumes competition, forking, founding, and physical immigration. It means giving people tools to reduce influence of bad policies on their lives without getting involved into politics, And this is something I really want to stress. The tools to peacefully opt out. For libertarians and the new wave of libertarians, exit and opting out are rendered through the language of video games. You should be able to choose the rules that you reside with and through as you choose the parameters of your game. You can change your settings, you can change the fonts, you can change the aptitudes of your characters. It's a video game. The language by which you think about governance is no longer political theory. These are the people that are giving the libertarians the theoretical background, and they come all from programming, financial circuits, and engineering. So just to give you a very brief summary, so when we look at the types of exit, I mentioned a couple, secede into the sea. They can be on special zones, and when we talk about some of the zones, it can be by selecting special normative arrangements. There are already international think tanks that sell the services of organizing, particularly for African states, how to create special regulatory regimes so they can set up companies or enclaves within their country. And it can be online. So, for example, you would have heard, or you could have heard, the architect that I'm going to talk about, Schumacher, that is involved in creating these residencies in Roatán, in Honduras, who is the head architect of Zaha Hadid Architects, one of the biggest architectural firms in the UK, is the design consultant for a Liberland, which is the first state that has gone to the metaverse, because they are trying to get recognition for a piece of land that they're occupying between Croatia and Serbia, and they're not getting that recognition, and they will never get that recognition. So they decided to create a metaverse equal kind of territorial distribution, but online. And so Liberland will sell plots of virtual land, will sell NFTs, and will have, of course, run on crypto in the first kind of true libertarian digital country. And it's still running today, right? So exit is the means by which when you exit, when you are able to actually choose with your feet, and you can choose the regulations that you want to be engaged with, should basically transform the process of government and the production of social orders into a product. I mean, that's the transition that libertarians are presenting. And for me, and this is, I need to spend a little bit of time here. This is the critical point. Politics wasn't politics, was born on the idea, or was justified, because we had an unavoidable conflict. Conflict was constant because we wanted to organize and justify a partition within a shared space, and that was always unstable. It doesn't matter the theoretical framework that we use. We can use a Marxist framework, we can use a post-foundational framework, we can use a more conservative framework. The problem is, how do you legitimize the partition of who are governed and who governs, who gets what and who doesn't? How do you legitimize it? The underpinning problem was that that partition was always unstable and always within a shared space. The paradox for politics is that we needed to organize within a given space a partition that was unstable, and we needed to do something else, and that justified politics. We needed the recognition, so that once we actualize that count, that distribution, would be willing to stay in that place. So politics had like two constants. One, conflict and instability of the partition, and the second one, probably causing the root to that conflict, is that it had to be on a given shared space. Politics required co-presence. Even notions of hegemony required for the one that you were putting your power onto to be there. That was the constant. Libertarians are doing away with the structure of politics by suggesting, you know what, I recognize the conflict. I don't want to live with your rules. But instead of saying, I'm going to form a party or bring the tanks to be in that same place with a different order, I'm going to leave. I understand the difference. I hate you. There's still an enemy. I'm not suggesting that this is peaceful. But instead of staying within, they replace politics by exit. And exit is never finished. They don't have any form of attachment to the type of enclaves that we'll talk about. They're prepared to be responsible. So going back to the idea of the game, there's no attachment to these enclaves that are being generated. So conflict acquires a new patina, is rendered through a different machine. It no longer imposes any form of confrontation directly within a shared space. It prompts a reflex of exiting. I want to spend the last kind of 10 minutes on the examples, on the cases. So hopefully will bring a little bit more sense. So in 2009, the Nobel Prize winner Paul Romer, after a successful TED Talk where he introduced the notion of charter cities, which were like an evolution to the special economic zones, where you could bring a foreign administration to a given territory to run their own rules of government and their own taxes, approached the Honduran Lobos president to suggest that what Honduras needed for development was not aid, was not any form of economic radical reform, except the creation and multiplication of special economic development zones, charter cities. I'm not going to get into the politics as to why Lobos accepted this. The corruption kind of case is kind of self-evident. I'm not necessarily going to get into that place. Romer then left the consortium when he found out that a lot of American lobbyists were really interested in backing this. And so he pulled away the support from his foundation. But the project went on. Lobos changed the constitution, which allowed Honduras government to create these zones, which when you create these zones, you see the taxing autonomy, the taxing authority, they can have their own customs, they can create their own regulations, they can run their own currency. Además, after moving forward, it got pulled down in 2012, then they changed the court to accept it. It was kind of still withheld, but unfortunately, when Aymara Castro got into power, he got into power suggesting that she was going to basically do away with the sedes. But because enshrined in the rule, in the law, was the idea that the only jurisdiction that could rule over the dispute was in the US, they assumed that the trial would be incredibly costly for them to actually revert the constitutional reform. So they're still ongoing. They're still present. What is Próspera at the moment? Próspera is the emblematic case for the libertarians. When you go to the Free Cities Foundation conferences, which I'm going to one in Prague next week, where I will meet all these kind of libertarian companies and projects, which I'm really looking forward to. Próspera is the project. This is the only one truly live, right? But this is what I want to show you. This is almost like a Netflix-like citizenship structure. Right? So you can buy your own residency, you can have different models, so you can choose your own jurisdiction. If you pay a bit more per year, those prices are out of date. But they managed to build a building that is fully occupied. They're running different companies. Just to give you an idea of why this works, is because you have no regulations, or you choose your regulations. It's very important for biotech companies. So there's a lot of anti-aging and gene therapy companies operating in Próspera because they don't have to comply with the FDA. Right? So that's the type of enterprise and acceleration that the zone promotes. Right? It's combined, and it's going to be combined with an export zone and an export processing zone. But going back to the games idea, I wanted to bring you just a note, just to the extent of the language kind of appropriation. So remember that I told you about Patrick Schumacher, Zaha Hadid firm, right? He's an anarcho-capitalist declared, right? He's pushing for that. And he hooked up, you see, Epic Games developed a visual engine called Unreal Engine. Unreal Engine, you would have heard of, is the engine that runs Fortnite. So Schumacher thinks that instead of planning agencies and planning regulations, Próspera should run on Unreal Engine. And they opened up the engine so as to connect it with a factory that would go from design input to fabrication. And so what Schumacher through design is trying to approach is the idea of how far they move in the possibility of replacing the state. All the instances where you would have said, oh no, but you need some planning permission, or you would have complied with some sort of master plan idea, or they're suggesting that there is a convergence of new technology that is allowing you to experiment with a different type of organization of rules. And design is at the forefront of this. This is one of the typologies where you go in and you work it as if you were building on Fortnite, but then that will go to the fabrication point, and allegedly this hasn't happened yet, but Próspera exists, right? So one of the things that I wanted to take from this one is the exit allows you to actually think of replace citizenship by an adapted forms of residence. Okay. And you basically give away the notion of citizenship for a form of avatar that can win or lose attributes and change the parameters of belonging, as you would change the settings on the game. If you have a bit more funds, you can increase the possibilities of your residency, because you can choose, instead of being tried in the US, you can be tried in Uruguay. That exists. So when you move into Uruguay, you select the juridical structure that will govern you. But ultimately, also what Próspera guarantees is that living is at no cost. This idea, if you don't like it because of some other changes, just leave. There's no conflict. So again, I go back to this kind of substitution of politics. Right? So there's no room for politics, because if you've got an issue that needs doing, just run it through the visual engine. If you disagree with it, there's no problem. Just leave. Nobody will point a gun. There's no violence. There's no authoritarian, allegedly, no authoritarian moment. How many? Well, I guess we're not that many. I can extend it a few more minutes. Right? Yeah. I'm not going to go too much on this. The case is really small, but it allows me to bring in, if you thought that I was talking to some sort of right or hardwired vision of libertarian and anti-state, there's still room. In the libertarian spectrum, I found out that the right goes a long way. So I'm going to move a little bit further to the right now. So remember that I talked about the two events, the financial crisis in 2008 and the pandemic as almost ignition points for the new wave of libertarianism. And so in the wake of that, this Canadian entrepreneur, Eric and Hendrik, decided that he could no longer tolerate the socialism and communism, his words, of the Canadian state. And he feared that the US, even with Trump's election, was basically a threat to the individual rights, educational rights. And so, in a true libertarian thinking structure, he suggested we need to develop environments where, and I wanted to bring the quote, we design eco-sensible, not eco-fanatic. So, communities that help lower your living costs, offer a high level of self-sufficiency. And this is the phrase that I wanted to use to justify my entry into the further right movement, and let you live among neighbors who share your values. Because remember, at the heart of the libertarian movement is this idea of voluntary association. But what this entrepreneur is saying, we want to create communities where you don't have to discuss where do you stand on gay rights, where do you stand on, and this is from the interviews I've had the chance to listen to, on transsexual rights, where do you stand on minority rights, because it will be a place of shared values. The voluntary relocation of people basically who believe in heteronormative, white, Catholic values. That's what he's not saying there, but he's suggesting. And it's not just my impression, because at the heart of this idea of thinking is a libertarian thinker that is highly quoted. Now he's really old, but he was a disciple of Rothbard, and it's Hans Hermann Hoppe. And he basically, reading the book is really hard as well. Like, you get exposed to these ideas and positions that are quite challenging. But one quote, just outside egalitarian fantasy lands, however, libertarians must above all be realistic and recognized from the outset as the alt-right does. So he differences himself from the alt-right, but then comes in the inequality, not just of individuals, but also of different cultures as an ineradicable datum of human existence. So it's this straight idea up to the front saying, we are different. There's no need of thinking of trying to protect minorities, of trying to actually create a state structure that will subsidize people from impoverished backgrounds. to a leap, that is nonsense. The reason for it is if we start from religion, we need to recognize the form of radical difference. Supported by, and I couldn't avoid it, but another very prominent hard right kind of influencer associated with the Milei government, but that speaks from Miami down across Latin America, and it's becoming, God knows why, incredibly influential. And just to put it in context, this is how I wanted to, I'm not going to get into the actual politics, but I thought the phrase was really interesting in terms of the shared values idea that we just heard. Well, I think most people actually can read Spanish, so I'm not going to necessarily translate, but this idea that I don't have to tolerate living with left-leaning people. And left-leaning is, I'm being polite. That's not how he refers to them. Lefties, right? He's not necessarily, although he's probably prone to bringing the military to actually enforce the fact of not having to share it. I have to say that that's potentially, in his case, the violence element is there. But in principle, this is what he's projecting. This idea that we should basically think about enclaves where we share the values. If the left-leaning people want to create a different enclave, go away. Go away. Now, what I found, and I've been working with this paradox, is that ultimately what this type of philosophical standing of radical difference from an individualistic perspective that shares equal value is that the only way that you can share the space is by imposing a form of exclusive equality. There's no other way. So suddenly, a movement that glorifies difference is basically leading towards a form of radical exclusive equality, exclusive expulsive equality. This only runs, and this is why I wanted to bring it. I know the case is really small, but at the heart of the movement, and I would even go as far, even in Próspera, even though they don't say it, you cannot live in Próspera if you don't share the values. Right? And the last point, just to take it a bit more radical in terms of thinking, so far I've been talking about enclaves that include humans and forms of residency. Right? In Próspera, biotech people that want to live as nomads in a digital residency, and in the eco village is an off-grid kind of village in the middle of Panama. I want to talk about a libertarian structure for non-humans. How would you create an enclave that basically is designed to extract and sustain and accelerate capitalism that can stand away from the point of view of thinking about humans residing in it? In 2024, perhaps the biggest piece of legislation that the Milei government passed was called the Bases Bill, and it was an incredibly big, very similar to the beautiful bill that Trump tried to pass. But this one, I would say, more structural. Within it, I'm not going to go into either what the Bases Bill contained. Within it, there was a special regime of incentives. And basically what it contains is this idea that Argentina, by law, suggests that investors that develop what is called a vehicle for operations, meaning an enterprise. It could be many things, but they have details as to what it should be and in which sector. So mining, technology, biotech, port infrastructure. Any vehicle for investment larger than 200 million will guarantee you the possibility of being exempt from import and export taxes for 30 years. But also, and more crucial, I think, is the ultimate protection that no legislation, not at a national level, not at a provincial level, municipal level, on any grounds, including environmental, can overthrow this legislation. So effectively, now, instead of just putting a border to a specific terrain, like in Próspera with the sedes or Morazán, which is the two kind of enclaves, instead of having a border, this is running on investment principle. If you can come up with 200 million or more, you can then state which is the infrastructural vehicle that would allow to create an actual physical domain that will be exempt from Argentinian legislation within Argentina. It was done, so at the first 3-4 years of implementation, the administration will capture the hard currency, the dollars, which Argentina desperately, as it's showing now, which you've seen the TV, that we needed dollars. He needed it then, he needs it now. In fact, the reason why he went to the treasury is because this is not working, but never mind. So the idea was, but after 4 years, they don't have to keep the dollars within Argentina. There's free movement of currency within this special domain. And this is the type of architecture that we're talking about. This is in Timbúes, it's going to be a logistical port. That is for copper. Argentina is trying to develop and move into copper extraction. No residency, yet the creation of exit enclaves effectively within Argentinian territory with a twist. Because tradition, when I first heard about this enclave regime, I thought, oh, this is very much like what we read on enclave economy. It's almost like neo-colonial forms of extractivism. But actually, that's like a novel twist. It allows Argentinians to become partners in the investment of the 200 million, to create an investment to be within Argentina, yet without. So it's Argentinian elite that are exiting legislation and embedding investment or capital and accelerating capital through these kind of entities that are now called vehicles for investment in Argentina, carving out, I'm suggesting that we will carve out the terrain of Argentina if the Supreme Court doesn't bring it down for 30 years. Yeah, well, conclusions. A couple of things. I think I want to stress that we shouldn't conflate the underlying ideas of the libertarian movement, this commercial exit, or the libertarians, the technical libertarians seeking for an exit through technological innovation, as being the ones that, I think in two beautiful books by Leandro, Los Ingenieros del Caos, yeah, and this one is really recent, but it's amazing, it's La Hora de los Depredadores, who basically suggest, oh, this has to do with basically trying to reinstate almost the hard right plus local elites, diminishing the potency of local democracy. And so a lot of the literature is focusing on and rendering this experiment as being part of an outright movement, which I hope I expressed. I'm not denying that they share points in common, but the ultimate game, unlike what the Ampoli focuses on, is not on elections. It might be a vehicle. They wouldn't have been here without an election. It's true. But election is a minor point. In fact, I would say this. Milei will probably, like every other government in Argentina, will fail. You know, that's the only right we grant every government is the right to fail. You know, I'm sure we're doing well. And this one, I don't want to predict it. Maybe, yeah. But the ideas underpinning the libertarian movement will endure. They don't rely on elections. They speak of a wider technological convergence that we need to capture that is not just the same or possible to be rendered through normal democratic transitions or challenges or electoral gains. I think there are tectonic plates that are converging towards actually criticizing and interpolating the rationale for justifying the state itself. And that's more worrying and more structural. It's another example of an organization that is has collected $500 million to actually experiment with acceleration zones worldwide. So my point is, the examples I've shown you do not matter, and they're not significant because of the scale. They're small, they're probably disconnected as well. But they pose a radical systemic challenge to the justification of our democratic institution. And I think we will see a lot of right governments fail, but this idea of exiting and creating the ways by which you can exit, and they're not just going to be residential expressions. It can be economic expression of carving out national territory, is something that, unfortunately, I think is going to endure. So,
great, thank you very much. So that was very fascinating. I mean, a bit scary. I mean, I know it's all small scale and maybe not important, but the basic principles are kind of very, very scary. There seems to me to be a kind of fundamental problem at the heart of all these particular libertarian ideas, which is that people are living, they have living bodies and they live in space. And you can't get away from that fact, or at least the only way you can get away from it is in the virtual world, where you can enter into a virtual world and do stuff that you can't do in a virtual world and so on. So this idea of not being co-present is impossible. Now, it might be different not to have an attachment to presence, right? You can certainly don't get attached to the place where you are, where you reproduce yourself and eat and breathe and whatever, But saying there can't be co-presence is like impossible. Therefore, there isn't such a thing as frictionless exit, right? If you enter into any kind of space, even if it's a kind of non-residential space, you invest something of yourself, of your time, of your energy, of your money, etc. And so if you decide, oh no, that's no good, I just want to go somewhere else, or you can just go somewhere else. But that's not a friction, because there's a cost involved somewhere of moving. So that's a thing.
I mean, I completely take the point. This is why yet we are not seeing a massive explosion. However, they will. I'm putting their hat on. I'm not necessarily agreeing with this. We are assuming that the exit is that exit is singular. For many of these people, exit is multiple, and so what you understood as being and some sort of minimal co-presence, for them it's a multiple form of experience. So to give you an example, some of these people have multiple investments, multiple residencies in multiple locations.
Okay.
So you are still assuming, in a very liberal Republican kind of structure, that it's the body that inserts itself into some sort of civil order. What they're kind of questioning is that already is quite restricted. We can have multiple manifestations. That's why I wanted to bring in the gaming kind of parable, because that is the language that allows them to do that. At the beginning, I agree completely with you. Say, yeah, but this is all an illusion, and we've been with this from science fiction onwards. This duality between the virtual and the real. The problem is increasingly, they are making money online with this multiple username. So Bloomberg just last year released a figure of it was astronomical. It was in the billions. I can't remember, but of virtual real estate movement in different virtual domains. People are not living in that virtual. They're making money. in that virtual space. They might have the residency in Roatan, have the investment in a virtual domain. That's the idea of blockchain is allowing them to develop avenues for accumulation of capital that we've not seen before. And I would add something else, which I probably just hinted in with Jove's idea. Exit is structured or scripted or uttered as a universal right. It's not. They might say or suggest that people will exit and we should all choose. I can tell you that if we run this script forward, there will be people that will only choose between even into a small or large garbage dump. There will be a huge majority that will be their choice, right? To be frictionless between, slums. So that's the other thing that is not being said. Right?
There's a couple of questions
Yeah,
online there.
sorry, two questions. No, if you want to comment, okay, two questions. Why call it decentralized? That assumes that there is a transfer of resource responsibility. Why take control of the state? Why take control of the state and destroy it if you want to exit? So I presume that one refers more to Millei's bit. The decentralized administration organization is a term from blockchain. So the decentralization meaning the possibility of creating a structure where no one has authority over the control of it. So they are trying already with contracts that are cryptographed and put in blockchain, so you cannot modify them or change them. So the decentralization refers to almost an informatic term in this sense. This is the first one. In relation to you asked about why destroy the state. This is Milley, right? I mean, I presume that that's what Alfredo is kind of talking about. I would say that Milley is an expression, it's a unique case within the libertarian movement. And the reason why I didn't want to go strictly into him is because I think it's more a diversion than perhaps what I'm reading more in what could be qualified as general ideas. So I presume that a lot of ideas put forward by Milley would not be shared by some of the, Patrick Friedman's grandson or people in Próspera. They might share, absolutely, ideas like the RIGI, ideas of basically doing away with regulation in Argentina. That absolutely. So again, remember that at the beginning I said that in Argentina, in libertarianism, there is minarchists that still sustain some form of state presence and anarcho-capitalists, which basically think that the best way forward is without the state. Milley has said in public, we need to move that he's an anarcho-capitalist, but he thinks that we need a transition. And the transition is through a minimal state. But that's the closest one I can get to. So for Milley, it's about stages. Right. Thank you for this. Oh, sorry. So there's another one. Sorry, I don't know. Oh, right. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't.
Yeah, well, thank you. This is, again, as Pete said, it's fascinating and depressing. Yeah, it keeps you thinking. I probably will suffer from the same problem as Pete, as my inability to think body, right? And things like, sorry for the language, having a shit. Or, what happens to those things, in the architectural term? Who makes the decision? And who cleans? I mean, are they talking about cleaning now? Who's going to clean? Who's going to cook? Clearly they're not. So are they just doing, like what is done in capitalist currently, which is a third party company we hire and we have no idea what it's. So, and obviously there will be fights between physical or non-physical neighbors, right? And who decides on that? Is there, they decide, they fight to the end, or you cannot just leave, as Pete said. If you say, I'll leave, but I'll take all the money that I gave you. Oh, you're not going to take the money. I noticed that it says that in one of them, I think the Próspera,
Yeah.
if it was a Próspera, that the rules cannot be unilaterally altered.
No.
Did they agree on the rules, or the rules given prior to you buying there are millions of questions about how in practice this kind of stuff.
This is brilliant because I've heard already, I shadowed a lot of the conferences from this libertarian. So and I'm going to one. And
you're being perverted, I can
absolutely not. But the thing that a lot of the discussions have to do with this, they get in contrast to you or me, they get excited about the possible solutions. They always seem to have a solution, however impractical it seems to me. But what I want to say is, this is what they're going through, right? This is what they're trying to experiment with. In Próspera, there are a couple of things in terms of the contracts. So the special economic and development zones develop like it's called an administrator that runs on a contract that is set in stone. When I talk about decentralized DOAs, decentralized organized administration, when you sign in to set these decentralized organizations, you get a token, so you can vote on specific decisions using the tokens. Of course, you can buy more tokens, so you get more votes. Próspera is not doing this because Próspera at the moment is trying to move towards that, but it's simpler in the sense that you sign into a contract, you sign into the juridical structure. So, for example, if in the case I presume that you meant, for example, if there is a crime, they outsource and they agree on which jurisdiction it will fall, and it's get tried somewhere. We're talking about that at the moment. There are only, I would say, 300 people living in Próspera proper. So these problems, given that they're all probably coming already with a lot of, and the shared values idea that there hasn't been a crime yet. But soon there will be. Absolutely, it's a matter of time. It's a matter of time. Everything will be outsourced, right? So it will be a service.
Including armies, because that's the big one, isn't it? Because
including
private armies.
No. So for the these libertarians, including the more on the hard right, one of the things that they detest is the idea of army from the very beginning, because at the heart of the libertarian ideology is the idea of non-aggression. I'm just quoting. So, sorry?
If we go and invade the place, and there's no security.
No. Of course there is security because you pay for it.
Yeah.
But what you don't do is you don't fund it through taxes permanently. So you hire them on demand.
Yeah.
And it has happened in Iraq already. So it's not like we need to invent the corpus. You call them up. This is what they again don't it's not.
No, I'm not shooting
I am not even the messenger. I'm just.
Yeah, so I want to continue on the issue of the body because I want to ask, what are they when do they talk about post-human cyborgs?
Yes.
Life?
Yeah. So in Próspera, for example, they're doing two things. So at the moment, and again, it mixes up with some of the things I've been doing. I read recently that it's going to be like they want to introduce the idea of game to accelerate possible startups. At the moment in Próspera, they have a very strong sector on both, as I mentioned, anti-aging and gene therapy. The connection with cyber is really close. I mean, and sectors that you would decide to actually have as emblematic, economic drivers. I haven't got a clear sense of what kind of drug they are using for anti-aging, but I know there's been a couple of testimonials of people that have had the therapy already.
From beyond the grave, right?
Yeah. So there is an idea of, and I think, and I will extend it. This is in Próspera, right? But when you read Praxis, this guy who runs this kind of the idea of the network state, which tries to answer some of your concerns. So when they talk about network state, it's not that everything is going to be virtual. It's that the network state is an idea of an interconnection. Right? I mean, I can bring up the definition. Again, very, very fragile, I would say, in terms of what it means. A lot of the literature, when you look at the project, is particularly with Praxis, for example, is this speech about extending the meaning of what it means to be human. This idea that in these accelerated zones, we can exploit our two potentiality, the potentiality of the body through this alternative therapies, new drugs, because we will have no regulation. That's kind of, that is not just in Próspera, it runs in many of, I've seen it in many projects.
My second question, very short, is thinking about, this is all very utopian, right, from that perspective.
Yeah, dystopian. Well, utopian from that perspective. Yeah.
Right? But thinking about the potential of these discourses, because there is something very important. You mentioned really, and there is something very opportunistic in that it was voted by all the mainstream political parties and Proponents, right? Within
Yes.
So you have these radical revolutionaries, but at the same time, it's something that can be activated, mobilized by mainstream also.
Absolutely. And that's something, for example, the CEO of the second special zone in Honduras, Morazan, who is a completely different model, who basically runs a real estate special zone that could allow him to run almost textile workshops with no taxes, but he runs it for low middle class families that want security. But he basically, in an interview, said, I'm setting up a libertarian project for non-libertarians. He understood that this is a market. I got a product, right? And in the really, the product was for the government.
Yeah.
In the end, the ones that pushed it through for the government. And what did the governors, in their mentality, which I despise, criticize, think is short-minded, is that they think, oh, I'm going to get cash because I'm going to get some of these projects, even if, as we were talking, if you build an enclave that will pay no taxes, somebody will need to eat, somebody will need some services, that's going to come to my province. I vote it. Not even to say anything about the bribes or corruption that might happen every time you need to arrange one of it. I'm not even getting to that. But that was the rationale. And they're not libertarian, but you're offering a product.
So it works precisely because it's not residential. It's not about living,
No.
just about production.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
For this presentation, I just wondering, I would like to know what you think about these experiments being just an illusion, because at the end, the exit that they are trying to have is possible because the state makes an exception, right? And from the explanations that you were giving, like those exceptions are possible because of political mobilization that happens with the rules of the state. So,
In some cases, not always. But I agree with you that if the ultimate game is actually to think about the justification of the state, you're going to have a confrontation, right? So you're going to have to actually, this will be Millet's argument. If I want to get to the end point, I need to conquer the state. So in a very Trotskyian sense, so he said it, I'm the mole within the state. Yo soy el topo dentro del Estado. Quote. Right? So in that sense, it's, but it's with yes, but let me do a counterfactual, and I don't want to be seen as, oh, I'm taking their side. I'm just going with the logic, imagine us discussing what kind of political organizations we would give ourselves in 1792, 93 in Paris. Imagine, or let's not be too Eurocentric. I want to take myself to Buenos Aires between 1810 and 1816. What kind of organizations do we give ourselves? And now you're saying it's impossible to think beyond the state. That's kind of the reflection. We thought beyond the metropolis. We tried, at least, we failed, we struggled, we had civil wars, but we thought beyond Spain. What they're suggesting is we need another 1789 moment. We need to think beyond the state. And in historical times, to give one element to them, the state is an institution, right? I mean, I completely agree. I'm frightened, I'm scared, I don't know what to think, I don't want them to win the argument. But also, coming from Latin America, it's not like our states are glorious. No, I mean, that's another problem. That's why it's flourishing. Yeah, Lucia.
No, I think in connection with that, and with your answer to that, the other question I had was, you said it's not that the strategy of exit is not a new one, and it's both in literature, et cetera, but, and you kind of mentioned it, but just let's remember the amount of utopian communities that existed in the United States alone. You know, I mean, through the period of throughout the world, but in the case of the United States, precisely, you know, the resistance to a centralized state went hand in hand for ages with these creations, still does. But, you know, there were many of these communities, and many of them religious, many of them no, and actually the United States was formed in part by an exit strategy, or many exit strategies. Right?
Absolutely, I completely agree.
Like the Mormons and whatever, you know, I mean, I lived very close in Indiana to one of those utopian communities.
But this is not about common people, right?
No, that's the problem.
Yes. There is this New Hampshire town that had like 10, 15 years ago that they tried that.
Yeah, so there's a bear book.
Yeah.
There's a town, sorry for people that don't know, there's a great book that tells a story. There's a town in New Hampshire that voted basically through electoral to actually go libertarian. But so when they started to get rid of the public services, they ran out with the problem that there was no garbage collection.
Yeah, that's the question.
And so the bears came in. Literally, the bears invaded the town, so they had to revert. So the bears was almost like a natural response to the libertarian. But going back to your point, I think it connects with both. One of the things after doing like an extended review, let's say, I wanted to highlight the difference between this new wave of exit. And the connection is that this type of exit is different because it's basically seen as a possibility of turning it into a product. Whilst other forms of exit at times had to do more with cultural expressions, religious expressions on the left. Incredible. Panstyrians in France, anarchic community. Of course we do. This one has to do with the acceleration of capital accumulation. Run, promoted by very rich people. So if I go back to the French at a moment, perhaps the movement itself is very reactionary in the sense that they're jumping the gun before we think how to rethink the state from a different perspective. They're already trying to put forward an alternative. Right? Maybe, you know, the problem is I can't tell what's going to happen in the next 50 years. My hunch is that, because I've been also trying to look at, there are also exits on the left. I've been looking at municipalism, very local, kind of radical expressions of trying to actually say, well, look, I may remain within the Argentinian territory, but I want to run my commune in a completely different way, with a different logic of solidarity. That is actually, I'm exiting, but from exploited capitalist relations, let's say. So it's a different type of exit, let's say. But the dispute is going to happen mainly because I can't see in the near future the state radically improving any form of service.
So the exit that you're looking is the municipal exit.
No, I was just trying, in the book, I'm trying to imagine, just to bring a glimmer of hope, that, you know, it never did, and it's still today, there are still exits on the left.
But a very narrow.
They are very small.
Like,
And, exactly, and one thing, they have no money. That's a constant, that's,
On that note. Okay, thank you.
No, thanks for the question, thank you very much. I need to read the novel. I need some reviewers.
Right, yeah.
I'll send it to you, no pressure. Yeah.